ballroom glittered with golden chandeliers and crystal glasses that chimed softly whenever someone lifted them for a toast. The air smelled of expensive perfume, aged wine, and the faint sweetness of vanilla from the dessert trays. Sundar. Pichai was used to such events, endless corporate dinners, where people wore their best smiles but hid their sharpest intentions behind polite conversation. But this night felt different. It was personal, for the first time in years. Sundar had brought his mother to a private dinner hosted by one of Google's most influential business partners. She was dressed simply, in a soft cream-colored sari, with a faint gold border, her silver hair tied in a neat bun. She clutched a small handbag, the one she had kept for years, and her eyes scanned the glittering room with the same quiet curiosity she had when she visited Sundar's school as a boy. He had always wanted to introduce her to the people who often made decisions that shaped the future of his company. Tonight was that chance. As they entered, heads turned. Some faces softened in recognition of Sundar's mother, while others looked on with curiosity, whispering to each other in corners. Sundar noticed, but he smiled. He believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. They were seated at a long table draped in white silk, the kind that made every glass sparkle under the lights. Sundar sat beside his mother. Across from the host, a tall, broad man named Martin Hayes, CEO of a massive software firm and one of Google's largest partners. Martin was known for his charm in public and his ruthless negotiating style in private. For the first half hour, everything went smoothly. People spoke about investments, innovations, and the future of artificial intelligence. Sundar's mother sat quietly, occasionally sipping water, smiling when someone spoke to her. Sundar translated complex tech terms into simpler words for her, and she nodded, listening intently. Then it happened. The waiter brought the main course, a carefully plated dish with tiny portions that looked more like artwork than food. Martin leaned over toward Sundar's mother and asked, "So, Mrs. Pichai, how do you like California so far?" She smiled warmly and replied in her soft Indian accent, "It is very nice. Very different from Chennai, but I enjoy it." Martin's eyes flickered with something Sundar didn't like. A smirk formed at the corner of his mouth. "Oh, I see," he said slowly, dragging the words as if imitating her tone. "Very nice. Very different." A few people chuckled under their breath. It was quick, subtle, but Sundar caught it. His mother's smile faltered, just slightly. She lowered her gaze, folding her hands in her lap. Martin wasn't done. "You know, Sundar," with her accent I'd bet half the room couldn't understand. "What's she saying?" Maybe she should have one of those translation apps running. He laughed at his own joke, looking around for approval. Sundar felt a flash of heat rise in his chest. His mother didn't say a word, but he could see it in her eyes. The quiet hurt, the kind she would never express aloud because she had taught herself to endure. He remembered being a boy in Chennai, standing beside her in the market when a shopkeeper mocked her for mispronouncing an English word. She had simply smiled then too, pretending not to notice. But Sundar had noticed. He had never forgotten. He took a slow breath, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to respond immediately, to shut down Martin's mockery in front of everyone. But another part told him to wait, to be strategic, because Sundar knew something Martin didn't. Tonight's dinner wasn't just about celebration. Tomorrow morning, a multi-billion-dollar contract between Google and Martin's company would be finalized. And Sundar held the final signature. But for now, he let the moment pass without confrontation. He leaned slightly toward his mother and whispered, "Amma, you are doing great. Don't let anyone make you feel less." She gave a faint nod, though he could still see the shadows in her eyes. As the evening continued, Sundar noticed Martin growing bolder. Each time his mother spoke, Martin made exaggerated facial expressions, raising his eyebrows as if struggling to understand. A few others at the table followed his lead, some smirking, others hiding their amusement behind their glasses. By dessert, Sundar had heard enough. He excused himself, stepping out onto the balcony where the city lights spread like a blanket of stars below. He pulled out his phone, opened his secure files, and began typing a message to his legal team. Inside, laughter continued. His mother was still there, holding her dignity like a fragile vase in her hands. When Sundar returned to the table, his face was calm, but inside, every decision was already made. He waited until the host raised his glass for a final toast. Martin's booming voice filled the room. To great partnerships and even greater futures. Sundar stood slowly, glass in hand. All eyes turned to him, and then, with a voice steady and unshaken, he said, "Before we toast, there is something." I need to say everyone froze. Even Martin's smirk faded slightly. What Sundar said next would not only change the tone of the evening, but also set in motion events that would shock every single person in that room. The room was utterly still. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the faint clinking of cutlery from distant tables, and the muffled city noise from outside all seemed to fade into silence. Sundar's voice, calm and measured, carried a weight that no one could ignore. His mother looked at him, a faint question in her eyes. She had known her son long enough to recognize the moment when he had made a decision, and once Sundar decided, there was no turning back. He placed his glass down gently on the table, his fingers resting lightly on its rim, as if controlling the urge to grip it tighter. "Tonight," he began, his voice steady, "I brought someone very special to me. Someone who shaped the person I am far more than any school, any mentor, or any business leader I've met in my life. My mother." A few polite nods went around the table, but Sundar's gaze was fixed on Martin, who leaned back in his chair with that same faint smirk, as if amused at where this was going. "When I was a child in Chennai," Sundar continued, "we didn't have much. My father worked long hours to save enough money so I could have an education. My mother, she managed the home, cooked every meal, and still found ways to teach me lessons about humility and respect. She didn't speak perfect English then, and she doesn't speak it perfectly now. But the thing about language is, perfection isn't the point. Communication is." Martin's smirk tightened, but he didn't speak. A few people at the table shifted uncomfortably. "What amazes me," Sundar went on, "is that even in a room like this, full of people who claim to value intelligence, innovation, and leadership, there are still some who believe an accent defines a person's worth. They don't realize that sometimes the person they are mocking has more strength and wisdom than they will ever understand." His words landed heavily. The people who had laughed earlier were now looking down at their plates, their silverware suddenly fascinating. Sundar's mother sat very still, her hands clasped together in her lap, her eyes glistening. He paused just long enough for the silence to grow thick. "I've worked for years to build relationships that are based on mutual respect. But respect is not negotiable. It's not something you only show to those you think matter. Respect is shown to everyone, especially to those who can do nothing for you in return." He reached for his glass again, this time lifting it. "So tonight, I toast to my mother, the woman whose voice in any accent carries more truth than any boardroom speech I have ever heard, and to the idea that dignity is worth more than any deal." The toast was met with a few hesitant clinks of glasses. The atmosphere had changed completely. Sundar took a sip, set his glass down, and sat back, his expression unreadable. Martin forced a laugh. "Well, that was heartfelt," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of sarcasm. "But let's not forget why we're here to celebrate our partnership, right, Sundar?" Sundar met his gaze without blinking. "We'll talk about that in the morning," he said quietly. And with that, the dinner moved on. Though the energy never returned to what it had been, conversations became scattered, laughter more forced. Sundar's mother spoke little for the rest of the evening, though she gave her son a small smile now and then when the event finally ended. Sundar escorted her outside into the cool night air. The city lights reflected in her eyes as she looked up at him. "You didn't have to say all that," she murmured. Sundar replied softly. "I had to." As the driver opened the car door for them, Sundar's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his legal advisor. Are you sure you want to proceed with what you just sent me? It will end the deal completely. Sundar didn't reply. Instead, he looked out the window as the car pulled away. His mind already fixed on the morning ahead, because tomorrow he would walk into that boardroom, face Martin, and deliver news that would shake his entire company. What Sundar didn't know yet was that someone at the dinner, someone he barely noticed, had overheard every word and was about to leak the story to the press before morning came. Asterisk. The night passed with an unusual heaviness. Sundar barely slept. The city outside his hotel window was still awake, its streets glowing with scattered pools of neon and headlights. But inside his suite, there was only silence broken by the occasional vibration of his phone. He had turned it face down, but the notifications kept coming. Messages from team members, reminders about tomorrow's contract signing, and a few from journalists who seemed to have caught wind of something at 5. In the morning, Sundar got up and walked to the window. The glass was cold against his fingertips. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the horizon carried that faint bluish hue that comes just before dawn. He thought about his mother, sleeping in the guest room down the hall. He imagined her still wearing that faint smile from last night, the one she had forced even after being mocked. There was a part of him that hated that she was probably telling herself not to take it personally. He knew her. She would likely be thinking about whether she had embarrassed him somehow, and that thought hurt more than Martin's words ever could. By 7 o'clock, Sundar's phone rang again. This time, it was his head of communications, Priya. Her voice was tight, urgent. You need to see this, she said without any greeting. It's already trending. He opened the news app, and there it was, a grainy photo taken from across the dinner table, clearly shot on a phone, accompanied by a headline, Tech partner mocks Sundar Pichai's mother at private dinner. Witnesses CEO may walk. Away from billion-dollar deal, article recounted the events of last night with surprising accuracy. The mockery, the uncomfortable laughter, and Sundar's calm but cutting toast in response. It didn't name Martin Darton directly, but anyone in the industry could guess. Social media had already picked it up. The comments section was a storm of outrage and speculation. By the time Sundar walked into the breakfast lounge, several guests were already glancing at him, whispering. His mother looked up from her tea, her brow furrowing slightly. People keep staring, she said softly. Why? Sundar sat down across from her. It's nothing you need to worry about, he replied, though he knew it was already out of his control. At 9 a.m. He arrived at the office where the meeting would take place. The boardroom was a wide, glass-walled space overlooking the skyline. The table gleamed under the white ceiling lights, and at one end sat Martin, flanked by two of his top executives. His expression was tight, his jaw set. As Sundar entered, Martin stood and walked toward him, lowering his voice but keeping his tone sharp. You've got some nerve letting this get out, he said. Do you have any idea what this is doing to my company's reputation? Sundar met his gaze steadily. Maybe now you know what it feels like to have something you care about treated with disrespect in front of a room full of people. Martin's eyes narrowed. You think this gives you the moral high ground? Let me tell you something. Business isn't about feelings. It's about results. And if you kill this deal over a joke... A joke? Sundar interrupted, his voice quiet but cutting. Mocking someone's culture, their voice, their identity. That's your idea of a joke? The air between them was thick, the silence stretching. One of Martin's executives shifted uncomfortably. In his seat. Before Martin could respond, Priya entered the room with a folder in her hand. Before we begin, she said, you should know that the press is waiting outside, and there are at least 6 major outlets already asking if Google plans to sever ties over what happened. Martin turned toward Sundar, his tone now urgent rather than angry. Listen, we can control this. We can release a joint statement saying it was a misunderstanding. If you go through with pulling out, you're going to burn a bridge you can't rebuild. Sundar didn't reply immediately. He walked to the head of the table, placed his folder down, and looked out through the glass wall at the city below. He could feel every eye in the room on him, waiting to see whether he would choose the safe, profitable route, or take a step that would redefine his reputation entirely. He thought of his mother's hands clasped in her lap, of the way her voice had gone quiet after Martin's words. He thought about the younger version of himself, a boy in Chennai, hearing people laugh at her for the first time. He turned back to the room. "We're not going through with this deal," he said. The words seemed to hang in the air like a dropped glass before it hits the ground. Martin's face flushed red. "You're making a mistake?" he hissed. "No," Sundar replied. "I'm making a choice. One I can live with." And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, the door to the boardroom swung open, and in walked someone Sundar never expected to see, holding an envelope that would change everything about the next 24 hours. Asterisk every head in the boardroom turned toward the door. The person standing there wasn't one of Sundar's team members, nor one of Martin's. It was an older man in a charcoal suit, his silver hair slicked neatly back. In his hand, a thick cream-colored envelope. He carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need an introduction. Yet, he introduced himself anyway. "My name is Rayesh Iyer," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "I'm here on behalf of several members of your partner's board." Martin shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing. "Rayesh, what is this?" "This is a private negotiation." "It was," Rayesh interrupted, his voice smooth but firm. "Now, it's a matter of governance." He walked to the table and placed the envelope in front of Sundar. "Inside is something you need to see before you make your final decision." The weight of the envelope was strange, heavier than it looked. Sundar slowly opened it, the room so silent he could hear the faint tear of the paper as he slid out its contents. There were several printed photographs, a few typed pages, and a single handwritten letter. The photographs were from the dinner the night before. They weren't the grainy, distant shots that had already leaked to the press. These were crystal clear, high-resolution images of Martin leaning across the table, his face twisted into mockery as he mimicked Sundar's mother's accent. Each frame caught the discomfort of the people around, the tight smiles, the diverted gazes. One photograph in particular showed Sundar's mother looking down at her hands, her shoulders slightly hunched, but it was the typed pages that caught his attention next. They were excerpts from internal emails, Martin's emails, sent to senior staff. Sundar's eyes scanned the lines, his stomach tightening as he read. Pichai's family is old-school Indian, heavy accent and all. "I'll try not to laugh tonight. Make sure the dinner's light on tech talk. Wouldn't want Mom to get lost." The letter was last. It was from one of Martin's own executives, addressed to the board, describing a pattern of similar behavior toward other partners, employees, and guests. It was signed anonymously, but Sundar could sense the frustration and exhaustion between every line. He looked up at Rayesh. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because," Rayesh said, "there are members of the board who are tired of him making decisions that embarrass the company. They see what happened last night as the final straw. If you walk away from this deal, it might push them to act. But if you choose to stay, you'll be enabling him, and they'll take your choice as silent approval." Martin slammed his palm against the table. "This is ridiculous. Sundar, you don't even know where those came from. This is all political maneuvering. You really want to throw away years of work over one misunderstanding." Sundar kept his gaze on the papers. In front of him, "Misunderstanding?" he said quietly. "You planned the joke before you met her." The color drained slightly from Martin's face, but he forced a laugh. "Oh, come on. It was banter. You're blowing it out of proportion." Rayesh looked. "Between them, Mr. Pichai, you're in a unique position here. This isn't just about whether you close a deal. It's about whether you set a precedent for how leaders treat people, especially those who can't fight back in the same room." The room felt heavier now. Sundar could sense that everyone was waiting, but he didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, his fingers steepled in front of him. He thought about the millions of people who looked up to him Not because of his title, but because they believed he stood for something more than profit. Then he thought about his mother. How she had carried him through years of struggle without once complaining about what she didn't have. How she had taught him to rise above insults without losing his dignity. But he also remembered something else. Her telling him, years ago, there is a difference between staying silent to keep peace and staying silent because you're afraid to speak truth. Sundar turned to Rayesh. And if I do walk away? Rayesh's expression didn't change. You'll be making enemies, but you'll also be making history. Before Sundar could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. It was Priya again, but she wasn't calling from outside the boardroom. She was calling from the press conference area downstairs. Her voice came through, low and urgent. They're already here, Sundar. CNN, BBC, Times of India. And they're asking one question. Are you standing with your mother, or are you standing with your partner? Sundar glanced toward Martin, who was now tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. He knew in that moment that his next action would not just decide the fate of this deal. It would ripple far beyond this room, far beyond the industry, and into the way people remembered him years from now. Slowly, he reached for the papers again, gathering them into the envelope. And then, without a word, he stood up, walked to the door, and left the room. The last thing he heard before the door closed was Martin's voice, sharp and panicked. If you do this, you'll regret it. But Sundar didn't slow his steps, because the next person he was going to see wasn't a lawyer, a board member, or a reporter. It was his mother, and what he was about to tell her would change how she saw him forever. Asterisk the hallway outside. The boardroom felt strangely quiet compared to the storm that had been brewing inside. Sundar walked with measured steps, the envelope gripped firmly in his hand, its edges bending slightly under the pressure of his fingers. The carpet muffled his footsteps, but inside his chest, his heartbeat was steady and deliberate, like the slow tick of a clock counting down to a moment that couldn't be delayed any longer. He reached the suite where his mother was waiting. She was seated by the window, a cup of tea on the small side table beside her. The sunlight had begun streaming in through the sheer curtains, spilling across her face and making the silver strands in her hair shimmer. She was looking out at the city below, lost in thought. When she turned and saw him, she smiled, that soft, familiar smile that had comforted him through every uncertainty in life. You're back early, she said. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room, pulled a chair closer, and sat beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He could hear the faint hum of traffic outside, the clink of porcelain. As she set her teacup down, finally, he placed the envelope on the table between them. Amma, he began, his voice low, I need to tell you something about last night. Her expression didn't change, but he could see the subtle shift in her posture, the way she straightened slightly, bracing herself. It's about what that man said? She asked softly. Sundar nodded. I know you didn't want to make it a big deal. But it was wrong, Emma. It wasn't just a careless comment. He planned it. He wrote to his team about it before the dinner. He thought it was funny. She looked down at her hands, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of the teacup. Sundar, I have heard things like that all my life. Sometimes worse. People mocking my voice, my words, the way I speak. You learn to let it pass. Not every battle needs to be fought. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. But some battles do, and this isn't just about you or me. It's about what we allow people to think is acceptable when they're in a position of power. If I ignore it, I'm saying it's fine. I'm saying it doesn't matter. She lifted her gaze to meet his, and in her eyes he saw both pride and worry. But if you speak out, you'll make enemies. You'll lose things you've worked for. I don't want to be the reason you suffer losses, Sundar. He reached over and took her hand in his. You are the reason I am who I am. Every success I've had started with you teaching me values, not shortcuts. If I lose a deal but keep my integrity, that's not a loss. That's a win. There was a long pause. The kind that carried the weight of years of shared history. The dusty streets of Chennai, the cramped kitchen where she cooked, the nights she stayed awake, sewing clothes for him so he could look presentable at school. Events stopped finally. She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. Then do what you believe is right, and do it without anger. Because the world will remember your dignity longer than they'll remember your words. He felt a calm settle over him. She was right. This wasn't about revenge. It was about setting a tone for what he stood for. He squeezed her hand once more before standing. There's a press conference downstairs, he told her. People are waiting to hear where I stand. I want you to be there with me. Her eyes widened slightly. Me? In front of all those cameras? Yes, he said. Because this is not just my stand. It's ours. They left the suite together, walking side by side down the long corridor toward the elevators. Sundar noticed the way people in the hallway looked at them, some with curiosity, others with recognition. Word had clearly traveled faster than he'd imagined. As the elevator doors opened, he caught a glimpse of the lobby far below. It was filled with reporters, bright camera lights flashing intermittently, microphones being adjusted, and journalists checking their notes. The hum of voices rose like a low tide. By the time they reached the ground floor, the sound had swelled. Flashes from cameras began the moment they stepped out. Security cleared a path toward the podium set up in the center of the lobby, a row of microphones waiting like sentinels. Pichai hurried over, her expression a mix of relief and tension. They're ready for you, she whispered. And they're not just asking about the deal anymore. They're asking if this is going to be a statement on respect and leadership. Sundar nodded once. Then that's exactly what it will be. He guided his mother to stand just beside him, where the cameras could see her clearly. She looked slightly overwhelmed, but held herself with quiet grace. The crowd hushed as he stepped up to the microphones. For a moment, he let the silence stretch, meeting the eyes of the people in front of him, making sure they felt the weight of what was about to be said. Good morning, he began, his voice carrying clearly over the crowd. Last night, something happened at a private dinner that made me think deeply about what we choose to overlook in the name of business. And today, I have decided not to overlook it. He could feel every lens and every microphone leaning toward him now. I'm here to talk about more than just a deal. I'm here to talk about respect, the kind that should be given freely to every person, regardless of where they come from, how they speak, or what they look like. He paused, glancing toward his mother, who stood watching him with eyes full of quiet strength. And so, he continued, I'm ending our partnership with a company whose leadership thinks mocking someone's culture is acceptable. The room erupted. Questions, camera flashes, murmurs of disbelief. But Sundar raised a hand, signaling that he wasn't finished. Before you ask about the financial implications, understand this? There is no profit worth the price of dignity. The applause started slowly, almost uncertain, but it grew. A ripple that spread through the crowd of journalists, employees, and onlookers until it became a steady, echoing wave. But just as the room began to settle, a voice from the back cut through the noise, loud and direct. Mr. Pichai, have you seen what Martin just posted about you? Asterisk, the moment the question rang out, the lobby seemed to tilt into chaos again. Reporters began flipping through their phones. Camera operators zoomed in tighter, and murmurs rippled like a low electrical hum through the crowd. Sundar didn't move at first. He simply looked toward the back where the voice had come from, his jaw tightening in that subtle way that only those who knew him well could recognize. Priya stepped closer, her phone already in hand. It's bad, she whispered quickly. He posted it less than 5 minutes ago, and it's already climbing the trending list. She handed him the phone. On the screen was Martin's public statement, written in a way that was meant to sting, but look respectable on the surface. Last night, I made a lighthearted joke at dinner, something that in any normal setting would have been taken as humor. Unfortunately, in today's overly sensitive climate, some people choose to politicize harmless banter. I wish Mr. Pichai the best, but Google's decision to walk away is short-sighted and emotional. In business, you need thick skin. The comments below were a storm, some defending Sundar, others siding with Martin, and many more twisting the incident into debates about culture, leadership, and political correctness. Hashtags were already multiplying. Hashtag respect over prit. Hashtag thick skin. Hash stand with Picha. Sundar lowered the phone slowly, his expression unreadable. His mother touched his arm lightly, her way of asking without words if he was all right. He's trying to change the narrative, Priya said. He wants to make you look reactionary, like you're the one who can't handle criticism. Sundar exhaled slowly. Then we'll make sure the world sees the truth, not the spin. He stepped back up to the microphones, the press still buzzing. I understand my former partner has shared his side of the story, Sundar began, his voice calm but firm, and I respect his right to do so. But let me be clear, this was never about a joke. It was about intent. It was about a leader in a position of influence, making someone feel small on purpose. The crowd hushed again, the tension in the air almost physical. Leaders are supposed to build people up, not tear them down to get a laugh. And if anyone thinks having thick skin means tolerating disrespect, then we need to redefine leadership altogether. He paused, letting the words settle. Then he reached into the envelope he had been carrying since the boardroom and held up one of the high-resolution photographs from the night before. It was the image of Martin mid-mockery, his face contorted, while Sundar's mother looked down. Her hands clasped. This is not humor, Sundar said, simply. This is humiliation. Flashes from cameras strobed across the room. Some reporters lowered their eyes. Others nodded subtly, the message landing deeper than any corporate jargon could. Sundar continued. If we excuse this, we send the message that status protects you from accountability. That power gives you permission to demean others. I reject that idea entirely. Respect is the baseline, not a luxury. The applause this time wasn't hesitant. It was immediate, swelling into the kind of sound that carried conviction. His mother's eyes glistened, and, for the first time since the dinner, her smile was unguarded, but just as the clapping began, to fade, Sundar's phone buzzed again. It was Rayesh. Sundar stepped back from the microphones, turning slightly so his conversation was out of direct earshot. You should know, Rayesh's voice came through, low and deliberate. Martin's board met this morning. Your press conference, it tipped the scales. They voted to remove him as CEO. For a moment, Sundar was silent. Not out of triumph, but because he understood the weight of what had just happened. Thank you for letting me know. He hung up and turned back toward his mother. It's over, he said simply. She searched his eyes, reading the unspoken truth there, that he had stood his ground and, in doing so, shifted something much larger than a contract. As they walked out together, the crowd parted to let them through. People clapped, not because a business deal had ended, but because a principle had been defended. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm, the city alive with its usual noise. Sundar inhaled deeply, feeling lighter than he had in days. His mother slipped her arm into his, and in that quiet, unassuming gesture, he felt the sum of everything that mattered. Dignity, courage, and the quiet strength of knowing you had chosen right over easy, and somewhere in the distance, in offices and boardrooms far beyond this city, others were taking note. Leaders, employees, and everyday people were talking about what had just happened, not as gossip, but as a reminder. Respect wasn't negotiable, not in business, not in life,